And now we're going to take a look at Notes 3, Natural Selection. It says the theory of evolution accepted by most scientists today was first proposed by Charles Darwin. Natural selection is a scientific theory that explains the process of evolution. There are 4 key principles of this theory. Number 1 is living things overproduce. They produce more offspring than can survive to make sure that some do survive into adulthood. For example, sea turtles lay hundreds of eggs, but then very few of them actually make it to maturity. Number 2, there's variation among offspring. All offspring are not identical. For example, a dog has a litter of puppies, and not all of the puppies are the same. There has to be variation for adaptation or evolution to occur. If all the organisms are exactly the same and there's a change in the environment that is not favorable for those organisms, then it's going to wipe out that whole population. If there are some that have some variations, be it a mutation or just a genetic variation that makes them a little bit different, a little bit more able to survive that change in the environment, then they survive and reproduce and pass those traits on to their offspring. And then you end up with a population that has a lot more with that trait. Number 3 says there's a struggle to survive, competition among offspring for resources. For example, a young pine tree competes with the older, taller trees for sunlight, water, and soil and nutrients. We usually think about competition being between animals, fighting over mates, fighting for food, fighting for water, fighting for territory. But it's also plants. You also see competition there as well, because think about in a young forest, there's a lot more going on the ground. There's more grasses and bushes and things down the ground. But if you go into an older forest that has a lot of larger trees with larger leaves, there's very little left on the ground. There aren't as many little shrubs and briars and even grasses left on the ground because they have outcompeted them for the sunshine. They catch their broad leaves higher up, catch the sunshine before it gets to the ground. So those on the ground have died out. There's competition for the nutrients in the soil and for the water. So there's also competition among plants. We just don't really think about it as much. So if there were no competition, then there would be no fittest. If there was no competition, then everybody would have the playing field would be level. Everybody would have the same chance of survival. But because there's competition, the one that's faster is going to get away from the predator. The one that's stronger is going to be able to fight off the others for food. There's competition, so that's the ones that are more fit survive and then pass those more fit traits on to their offspring. And those who survive are the most fit. Which is the types of evolution. We talked a little bit about divergent yesterday. Becoming more different. So organisms of the same species develop adaptations that make them more different. That was divergent. And convergent is kind of the opposite. Adaptations from different species make them more alike. So organisms that are living in the same area, even though they're not the same species, may develop similar traits. For example, you look at penguins that are birds, and then dolphins that are mammals, and sharks that are fish. They're all swimming around in the ocean. They all have that same sleek, water dynamic body form because they all live in the water. And penguins' flippers are really wings, but they use them as flippers as the dolphin does. They have become more alike because they are dealing with the same stressors in the environment or the same needs in the environment, and they've adapted to fit that environment. So that would be convergent evolution. Coevolution is when two species evolve together. One changes in response to a change in the other. Think about there are plants that can produce toxins to ward off certain predators, but then there are some insects that they need because those insects are maybe their pollinators. So as they develop different toxins to get rid of predators, then they have selected, by default, the insect that pollinates them gets selected for the ones that are resistant to those toxins, and then you end up with a population as you have the population of plants that have the toxins, you end up with the population of pollinators that are resistant to those toxins. That's coevolution. They evolve together because they help each other out that way. And next we'll look at the questions. A scientist is studying 2 types of plants in the desert. Although the plants are not related species, their appearance are very similar. What type of evolution does this represent? Okay, they are coming together to look more alike. They are adapting to the environment. They're both in a similar environment, so they're both going to need to adapt to the same conditions. So that makes them more alike in their appearance, in their behavior, or whatever it might be. They're becoming more alike because they're dealing with the same stressors in the environment. That is convergent evolution. 2 through 5 says match each of the following with one of the 4 principles of natural selection. A says living organisms overproduce. Species tend to produce a lot more offspring than are going to survive because, again, the world is harsh on organisms, and most of them do not end up making it to maturity to be able to reproduce themselves. So they overproduce. B, there's a variation among living organisms. If there were no variation, then everybody in that population would be susceptible to changes in the environment, and nobody would be more suited to that environment or more fit. And there would be nothing to select for. They would all be the same. So if there was a major change in the environment and there was no one more suited, then that entire population would die out. C says living organisms compete with each other. Okay. There's limited resources in the environment. They have to compete over food, water, space, mates. If there were no competition, then there would be no need to be one more fit than the other. And the survival of the fittest, that one who's able to outcompete, whether it's being faster to outrun the predator, or longer neck to reach the leaves at the top of the tree, or better camouflage to hide from predators. Whatever it is that makes them more fit, they will be more likely to survive, make it to maturity, reproduce, and then pass those traits on to the offspring. So it'll be the survival of the fittest, and those more fit traits will be what gets passed on. So the first one says, oysters release thousands of eggs into the water at one time. Okay, most of those are not going to make it. They're going to get eaten or just fall to the bottom of the ocean and not get the chance to hatch. But that would be overproducing. That would be A. Number 3 says mountain goats fight over a potential mate. They're fighting. They are competing for a limited resource. So that would be competition. Living organisms compete with each other. That would be C. Number 4 says 2 polar bears with the thickest fur, and one with the thickest fur and longest claws survive because the thick fur is going to protect them from the cold. It's going to protect them from the claws of the other bears. They got long claws so they can fight back. So that is going to be D, survival of the fittest. The one that is more fit will survive in that environment. So that answer would be D, survival of the fittest. And number 5 says 2 squirrels of the same species have different length tails. Well, their tails are different. They have a variety of lengths. That would be B, there is variation among living organisms. So our answers there should be A, C, D, B. And now we're going to look at the natural selection handout. An adaptation is an inherited characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce in its environment. Over time, adaptations become more and more common in a population. For example, suppose that the water in the pond gets darker over a period of 4 years. The diagram and table below show what might happen to the frog population in that pond. So right here, the pond is light, and then over the 4 years, it's getting darker and darker. Notice, to begin with, there are a lot of light-colored frogs and just a few dark-colored frogs. Well, as the pond gets darker, we get more darker frogs. Why might that be? Maybe there's a great blue heron that comes by and likes to eat frogs. Well, if the pond is getting darker, then it can see those light-colored frogs easier, so it's going to eat a few more of those light-colored frogs. And then there's going to be more dark-colored frogs to mate, and they produce more dark-colored offspring, and again, more of the white frogs get eaten. And then all that's left to reproduce is the one that's carrying that trait of being darker colored. So eventually you end up with a darker colored frog population. So adaptations over time. How many light-colored and dark-colored frogs? Well, there were only 2 dark-colored that first year. And then the second year we have 1, 2, 3, 4 light-colored frogs and 4 dark-colored frogs. We've kind of evened out there, but we didn't stop it even because the pond's getting darker, so those white frogs stick out and get eaten by predators even more. So then we have 2, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 the dark frogs. And then by the last year, all of those white frogs have been eaten up. And all that's left to reproduce and pass their traits on are the dark-colored frogs. Number 1 says, in which year are the number of light-colored frogs and dark-colored frogs greater than the number of dark-colored frogs? Well, year 1 is the only year that they are more, but by year 2 they are even. So year 1 has more light-colored frogs. Number 2 says, how did the number of light-colored and dark-colored frogs change over time? The darkness of the pond selected for the darker frogs because they were more camouflaged. So they were able to survive and reproduce and pass on their traits. Number 3 says, which adaptation is best suited to life in the pond in year 3? The light-colored or dark-colored? Now, year 3, that's almost to the darkest. Year 4 would be the darkest. It's gotten a lot darker, and so it's selecting more for the dark frogs. Those white frogs are getting more and more vulnerable because they stick out like a sore thumb in that dark pond. They're going to get eaten, so it's best suited for life. It would be the dark color. Number 4 says, how do the dark-colored frogs show survival of the fittest? They were more camouflaged, so they were more suited for the environment, or more fit for the environment, and they were more able to survive. So how is natural selection different from artificial selection? In natural selection, the environment naturally selects for those whose traits make them more suited to the environment. Artificial selection, someone chooses a trait that is desired for other reasons. Maybe it's the farmer choosing the bigger chicken and mating it with the other bigger chicken. It's not necessarily a trait that nature would select for, but someone chooses for a desired trait that is not necessarily more suited to the environment. Artificial selection is much like that selective breeding that we talked about previously in the genetics unit, where you choose traits and you breed organisms, dogs, cats, pumpkins, chickens, for the trait that you wanted. And you select that trait yourself. It's not necessarily more suited to the environment.